people at a distance. And certainly every diocese has its particular canons, as you know. The great advantage which you have right now is that, I think I'm correct in this, that all three dioceses have their constitutions online, and you don't have to be scrabbling to try and find the latest copy of the Constitution, which often your predecessor took with him or her, and nobody replaced it. Because there it is set out very clearly the various policies which we have in the diocese to be followed. And if Archbishop Ted Scott, one of our former primates, always used to say, there is no such thing as a foolish question. And he was right. There is no shame, because sometimes people do interpret this in this particular way. There is no shame ringing up your regional dean or rural dean or your area archdeacon and so on, and say, look, what do I do in this situation? Far, far better to ask the question and get some advice than to just blindly go on when you're not sure about something. And the diocesan office is there to help. It's there to serve the diocese. And it's a very difficult, or at least I found it very difficult, to stress that point over and over again, to make sure that people were aware you could always ask, and please ask rather than act and then think later. Communication, as we all know, is ultra important. When working as a hospital chaplain, one used to sit down with trainee and junior nurses for sessions sometimes. And at those sessions, my first point was always the most important people in the hospital that you really should get to know are the people who work on the switchboard. Because they're the people who can connect you and link you up. And how you treat people in positions like that will fundamentally show and be shown by how they respond to you. And certainly when it comes to working in the parish, we all have our own individual styles, of course we do, and ways and methods of working. But what is common to us all is that if we don't communicate, and if we're not seen to be engaged or involved, invariably problems arise. And you could say the same for all these things that are up on the screen right now. Canons and policies of the diocese and handbooks. Now, that varies from diocese to diocese. There are handbooks which give you, specific things as a cleric as to how to handle what the policy is, what the bishop's directive is, etc. And such handbooks are invaluable when it often comes to the unusual rather than the usual things. For instance, let me just illustrate that by when cremation was first introduced. And as you know, as a province, we were very, very late in introducing cremation. And it was only here in the city that crematoria started to be built at the funeral homes. Well, for the Eastern Diocese, there was a policy which said that if the body was going to be cremated, a priest should be present. I don't know if that is still in effect, because it's too long ago since I retired, and I don't have a handbook at home. But that was there just in the early days to safeguard the dignity of disposal was indeed being followed. And I was present at a number of such things, because in those early days, and there are many people here online who remember it, I'm sure, there was all sorts of hardware that had to come off the casket before it could go into the cremator. Because it was metal, etc., whereas now it's all plastic. But that directive, and there were some people who kicked and fought against that. They weren't going to do this, and so on. They had more useful things to be doing. That it all comes down to a matter of organization. All these administrative matters here, it's all about organization. And things that you have in the parish, like the registers, it's extremely important that those registers, the marriage, the burial, etc., as well as the register of services in the sacristy, be kept up to date. Don't leave these sorts of things so that, well, they get done when I've got time to get them done. Because if that happens, that's when the mistakes occur. I remember the Department of Vital Statistics on one occasion phoning me up for irregularities of paperwork from dioceses. It was in the Eastern Diocese, of course, irregularities, and you would not believe the irregularities that had taken place. And it took 3 meetings between myself and the Vital Statistics, and going to parishes where sometimes personnel had changed and so on, before we got it all sorted out. And it was simply because people didn't do the job and didn't fill out the paperwork, and then it just got left and was poked somewhere, and it was sitting there for a year, more than a year in most instances, because the department is very, very tolerant. I don't know what your policy is. I mean, we all have our own personal policies, but my personal policies, particularly where marriages were concerned, and perhaps this is a failure on my part, of lack of trust of the two people you just married, that I always spent the money putting a stamp on a letter and sending the certificate to Vital Statistics. I did not leave it to the parties involved. And so
I might just say, O'Neill, what this brings to mind for me is the importance, particularly with trainees, to understanding why we do so many of the things we do. So one of the emphases we have this semester, for instance, at Queen's in the vocational development seminar for those who are in ordination stream, is in our liturgical practicum. But our focus is very much this semester on why we do the particular things, the rituals, and why they're done the way they are and what have you, with the mindset of it being that that will give people a yardstick to be able to determine the scope of adjustment that they can make, but also the breaking point where they should or should not do particular things, and be making adjustments or exemptions for themselves. And I think this is a part of like your example there on the cremation, and we don't want to go on a big long discussion about that, but that's a good example of people understanding why there are some practices in place, because it is about respecting the dignity of the person, the human person. And I again, back to my time in healthcare, we often came into issues with some of our chaplains and clergy who would say, there's no need to call me if there's no family there when someone dies, right? But it was about the dignity of everyone. And, everyone matters or no one matters when it comes to respecting matters of human life and human dignity and what have you. And yes, providing support for family is an aspect of it, but being with a person in their dying hours, or being there to say a prayer of commendation shortly after their death, I mean, that is not a show for the family and what have you. It is because it is a person who has died and what have you. So understanding like why there are practices in place, I think helps people to appreciate it and recognize sometimes the significance of the failure or the omission of doing things. And sometimes it loops itself around when people start to complain that something wasn't done, something that you might kind of minimize in your own mind, but discover, these people, and we've often heard about, they're making a bigger deal about it than it ought to be. Well, maybe you made a little ordeal, if that's a word, after you've minimized
That's
it.
right.
But anyway, we'll just take a moment though to see if there are questions or comments or thoughts that have come to mind from anyone online related to like these types of administrative matters and the importance of giving it a bit of attention in a practicum and in a supervision experience.
It's Bob here.
Hi, Bob.
I guess for me personally, I try to get that stuff done as soon as possible. I'm the kind of person that, when it's done, it's out of the way. I don't have to worry about it. And, so that's always been my practice. I know over here in Nova Scotia, I don't know, well, actually, I'm in New Brunswick now, but other place, I'm not sure if the priest had to be with the at the crematorium. I never have. That's never been a case for me. So I don't know about that practice. But and of course the policies and the canons and all that sort of thing are much more accessible now and much easier to get your hands on. And I think the previous speaker was talking about sending away statistics. I think now with our statistics, when the person is married, we don't even have to put a stamp on it. It's postage paid, and we just drop it in the mail. So they took care of that problem for us.
That's interesting, Bob. And the illustration which he gave about cremation was really just pertinent to this diocese because it was such a new form. It was to make sure that for everybody's sake that things were being done in a dignified manner. That's especially direct cremation. And so on. I think the other thing which I'd like to say is we'll find out there are other people who want to ask questions and so on.
Any other questions or comments from anyone?
Hi, it's Ruby here. I had a phone call come in just a minute ago, so I missed what you just said last. But on speaking about policies and filling out forms and stuff, when I was a postulant, the priest that I was working with was a former lawyer. And he was like the ultimate of sticklers for putting in things. He told me wherever anybody had to sign anything or there was something written, always underneath print so that it would be legible. And I still do that today, and I'm glad I do, because, you know, some of the signatures of people, you have no idea who they are. But I know that personally I'm a stickler for that, filling out forms, getting things done right away. And like you said, when they're done, they're done. You don't have to think about them anymore. And I've always been told that our registers are legal documents. So it is our responsibility to make sure that these things get done.
Correct, Ruby.
It's Bob here again. Just for fair play, as I said, I'm good at getting those things done, but now is the time of the year for parish statistics, and that's got to be, that's not on the top of my list, but I will get it done. And I have a postulant, and he's going to get his experience with it too.
Well, that's always good to have the exposure at an early point. Ruby, just as an aside, the English system about marriages at one thing was even worse than what you were doing in printing the name under the signature. Was not even allowed, because you had two sets of registers, one which went to Somerset House, but the other one was kept in the parish. But if you made one mistake in one register, the same mistake had to be made in the other register. And I have, as the deacon, I got the princely sum of 18 cents for every hand copied one. That's what we were paid in the 60s. And I used to sit there with tracing paper over the top of signatures because they were so totally illegible. So, possibly you've not been subjected to that, and I wouldn't wish anybody to be subjected to that ever again. I don't know whether that still appertains or not, because that was years ago. Going back to something earlier, which was mentioned by the provost from the previous session, and this is where you have a number of people who are changing parishes around the same time. And we did have such an experience of that, where I think we had 7 people. So what we did in that situation was, after they'd been there a little while, we got the 7 together. And then we spent a whole day with the Chancellor of the Diocese, some heads of committees, so that people had real good exposure to the types of things that we're talking about here, and some things that pertained particularly just to the diocese. And it was very worthwhile. It was a very worthwhile occasion, but we only did it the once. But other times we tried to do it on a sort of individual basis when there weren't as many people. But I remember we did do that on one occasion, and it did make a substantive difference to those in the diocese and in the various deaneries that way. But, you know, it all really comes round to organization. All administrative matters and so on, it's just like the parish. When you get up in the morning, you should know what you're going to be doing. Your framework and outline should be there as to what you are going to be doing for that day. Oh, sure, it may get all scuttled by one phone call or this sort of thing. But my experience was with people who really suffered difficulty, it was because they were not out and about and being seen. I'll give you a specific example. I had one priest came, and the rule was 3 years as a parish treasurer, and then there had to be a new treasurer. And the person came and said, "I'm going to have to ask you to present to the diocesan council our apologies, but we need an extension for this parish treasurer." To which I said, "Well, which parish treasurer?" It was a multi-point parish. "Are you looking for? In which congregational treasurer?" And the person told me, and I looked. It happened to be a hymn, and I looked at him and said, "When were you last in that community, actually visiting, and not just there for liturgical function?" And there was total silence. And I said to the individual, "So you're going back home now?" Yes. I said, "And what are you going to do now?" This was about 11:45 one morning on a weekday. And the individual said, "Oh, well, I've got family time now. And then I've got a meeting tonight." And I said, "What you're going to do now is go home, have your lunch, get the car out and go into that community and do some visits looking for your treasurer." I never heard another word from the individual. And several weeks later, I said, "Did you find your treasurer?" "Oh, yes, no problem." Sometimes, I know many times it's not as simple as that. But that tells me reams. It's because there isn't organization to what is happening and how one's doing things in a structured form. And that's what there has to be. And the majority, if not all, because you're all anxious to learn, or else you wouldn't be here today. Often you're not the people who are the culpable ones on this front at all. But organization is everything.
And it's very helpful, Neil. Thanks for sharing the thoughts and the experiences and the examples. But it illustrates the importance for everyone, but especially for trainees, people getting set up in ministry, whether they're, as we talked earlier, just coming into it or transferring from elsewhere or something different, that they recognize that all of the things they will do in ministry, and there are so many things, liturgical and pastoral and administrative and prayer, and all of it is connected, and it can't be, and if one allows things to seem to be disconnected, they in fact are disconnected. Or if you leave out a significant chunk, like you mentioned, visitation, important piece to it. And it is easy these days, and I think an item that we'll probably have a little bit of chat on in our last class, but the reliance on online engagement is it can have a bit of a detrimental impact on how people form their ministry and how they carry it out. There is an ease to it sometimes for person doing the ministering, and in some ways an ease for those to whom you're trying to minister. But unless the relationship is there, it's not going to have much value for anyone. And I think we'll take a little bit of time to have that type of discussion on no and particular challenges in our last session. But it is one, and I've heard examples not too long ago of individuals, who are in ministry, and they are, as Neil has mentioned, not relatively new to ministry, but things are not going well for them, and they aren't doing what people expect them to be doing. But people are noticing that they seem to be always online. They seem to be always on Facebook and posting stuff, and some of it is sometimes not very appropriate for one who is in ministry. And so those types of things are relevant as well and deserve a bit of attention, to raise the awareness of one, again, of why these things are relevant and important. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to ask if anyone has any particular comment or response on these administrative matters that we've looked at, some of them last week, and with Neil's time with us today. And then we're going to move into the assessment and evaluation component with Carmel. But before we move on, just want to see if anyone has a last minute comment or observation on the administrative matters.
Well, it's Bob here again. I was involved in shared ministry one time with another priest, and we had 3 parishes, and at one of our annual meetings, they had tried to secure a treasurer, and they couldn't do it. And so in the meeting, we came to a point where I had to stop the meeting and say, well, if we can't have a treasurer, we can't continue. And nobody knew what to do. And so I said, well, who did you approach before? And they gave me the name. I said, call her again and ask her. And she said yes. And we proceeded.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. That's good to know. If I could crave an indulgence, Bob, my very first ACW meeting, we were looking for a president. We did the business of the meeting fairly quickly until we got to this nomination. I think we were at the nomination point at 9. We were still at the nomination point at 10, at which I asked, had anybody brought any food? So then we ate, and then we went back, and we were still looking for a president. So eventually I said, I'm going to put my coat on, and I'm going to walk up the harbour, and I'm going to come back and call for a president. And if I don't get a president, I'll shut down the branch. And I did just that. And when I came back, just like it happened for you, a person volunteered to be president. So year 2, I was at another meeting, a much smaller group, where I tried the hat and coat trick, but it didn't work the second time.
I love it.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Neil. Okay. So we're going to move on now to the issue of assessment and evaluation. Before Carmel came, and actually before I turn on the recording, I have to apologize to those who are viewing. I missed the first little bit of the session. Turned it on early in Neil's session. I'll come back to this stuff on the time management. But so if you're wondering why you cut into it, you just missed only my little bit preamble to the class, which was essentially a review of the last class. Colonel Doyle, as I mentioned at the start, but wasn't recorded, so for those who are online and those who were viewing the recording, Carmel is our Director of Student Programs at Queen's and is coordinator of our Supervised Practice of Ministry program. And that's one of the internships that we have, along with our Supervised Parish internship program for those in ordination stream, and sometimes our clinical pastoral education. Carmel, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, thank you, Rick. I'm going to need to put on a stick here.
Okay, and I'll let you sit here, and I'll shift the camera back to here. You can put your Just like that here.
For them that be
Okay.
here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, just gotta see which one is yours. Okay, you sure?
Yeah, I said top one.
Okay. Okay,
Okay.
I'll let you take it from.
And here. Okay, so hello to you all. I have no idea how many or who's online.
There's about 11 online.
Okay, I'll see names here on the side now. James and Jolene, Mary Ann, Paulette, Robert, Gerald, David, Charlene, Amanda, waiting for name, and us. Who is it?
Ruby.
Ruby.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello to all of you. And Rick asked me to come in and talk about evaluation in particular by looking at the SPM, Supervised Practice of Ministry. Come on, sweetie, close down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so obviously the very first part of knowing what your role is in supervision is to understand really clearly what the goal of the program that you're evaluating is. You may have all kinds of nice little things you want to evaluate, and you know, if they're pertinent under the particular umbrellas of the program, or if they are so large that they block some of the areas that are there, and you know, it's an almost taken for granted that they be in a person, but maybe they're not. Well, then they become relevant, or as they affect those goals. But it's not up to the person who is doing the supervision to change the nature of the program. Not on their own. If they have comments to make, suggestions to make, most certainly they're welcome. But students will be required to do what the program asks. So it's really, really important to understand that. So for this particular program, and we just use it as an example, that's all it is. This is a program in which people are learning some chaplaincy skills, and it's changed a tiny bit from this for this coming year, but we'll just stick with what's here, because I'll make myself do what I'm asking you to do, which is to just look at what the program says. So this is our 2018 one is not totally fine-tuned yet. So within this, that's what they're looking at. So if you look down to this paragraph, the second one there, the focus is the development of pastoral self-awareness, pastoral presence and skills, and pastoral theological reflection. So those are the three areas that you would be involved in walking with students as they explore those areas, and that you would also assist them to become more self-aware, hopefully more skillful, and to be able to engage the tradition of our belief. So those are the main pieces. And then under each of those categories, we have named, and we're not going to go through these in any detail, just to give you a sense, to develop their awareness of themselves as ministers and the way their ministry affects others, to develop their awareness of how attitudes, values, assumptions, strengths, and weaknesses affect their pastoral care, to develop their ability to engage and apply the support, honest input, and insights of their peers, and of course their supervisors, for the integration of personal attributes and pastoral function. Now, I can go on to the others, but I'm not. They're there, and if anyone is interested, I can certainly send them out. But what I was going to, let's just take a look at these, because they're significant enough. How would you evaluate such topics as to develop each student's awareness of themselves as ministers? I won't even look at the second part of it yet. So I'm going to open it up and ask him just first, stop for a second and think. If you're going to be with a student for a period of 4, 8, 12 weeks, or depending upon what the particular programs are, knowing that awareness of themselves as ministers, what would be some of the indicators you would expect that can give you insight into how the student sees himself or herself as a minister? I'm just going to open it up for a second. And anyone who wants to has the floor. Okay, David.
Okay, you might ask the student to describe how they see themselves as ministers and how they feel others see them.
Okay, that would be an introductory piece. Now let's say that person has been in either visitation in the parish at, say, long-term care facilities or in healthcare facilities. What would you be looking for after, let's say, a week or so of that as you listen to the person? Nancy, you were going to say something too.
No, the only thing I was just going to speak to was just to understand what they define as a minister themselves, how they see that defined in their person.
So for them to know what the role is that they're filling, and then to ask them, first of all, what do you see this main focus of your visitation?
Yeah.
And
because how I would understand it
right.
for myself versus how somebody else would see
exactly.
it. I'd be curious to start as that starting point for me.
Be a real good one. And you'd say both two things. So you'd ask, what do you see as? What was your experience as? And what did that feel like for you?
Yeah.
So that would be 3 immediate pieces. And to listen as the person speaks. Now, I should take a step back, big important step back, before we even get to that. And that's to say, what do you see as your role as, and the traditional word has been supervisor. Okay, so what do you see as your role of supervisor? Is the supervisor one who is at arm's length and observing and reporting and interacting, or is the supervisor one who is going to walk with the person? In this particular program, it's an interesting blend of both. In some, you are very strictly required to be arm's length, and that is your role, and you know it, and the student knows it. In some others, you may be one who totally is walking with, and that puts a whole other umbrella over, and it creates a totally different space than the one who is fully at arm's length. In this particular program, we ask the supervisors, no small thing, to do both. To do both. So that, because if we're talking about a person's awareness, you can't observe, you can look at markers from the outside, but unless you understand what they think it is they're doing when you see those markers, it'd be like telling me time after time after time, that top is not the one you should wear. Okay, so I put on another one. That's not the way you should dress. Okay, so I don't do that. This is not what you should. Okay, would someone please tell me what's expected here on that other level? So the supervision is against the pieces. Yes, Rick.
Another aspect of this, and SPM in its initial forms, continuing to evolve and make adjustments. But the initial development of it, I did it a good while ago. But I did it because I had in a format that came very much out of what we were using in healthcare, with people who were there in various professions, physician, medical trainees, nursing, and other healthcare professions. But a big component in those models, and it's what we sustain here, is that you cannot put the person receiving care at risk for the benefit of students. So the supervision, the oversight by somebody who is a competent practitioner is essential to it.
Yep.
Somebody has to be, in other words, able to sign off in a more formal context, for instance, in healthcare. But that's a big piece of it. And what Carmel is describing is an excellent illustration of, you can't just do it remotely and go back over it like you would with a term paper and say, oh, you should have done this and you should have said that. Well, too late if you've been involved with somebody and kind of didn't handle it properly along the way and sent someone off with wrong information or inadequate care and treatment. And so I just want to kind of bring that practical but very important ethical and credible point to it.
And to build on that whole notion of whether it's from a distance or you're walking with. I'm not using walking with there just as a metaphor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That means that you literally go with these individuals, particularly at the beginning, and then at least 2 or more 3 times in some setting so that you can observe what's actually happening. Hopefully the first time you may be the one doing the visiting. They will shadow, see what happens, and then you let them, and you would start with those who are, I'll say, least vulnerable for the visits. And as you see the person is gaining their own awareness and their skill set is coming up, you can allow them to interact with people who are a bit more vulnerable, but always under supervision. So walking with is not a sweet little metaphor for saying make them comfortable, although, you've got to have enough of their trust. Otherwise, they won't tell you. They'll tell you what you want to hear or what they think you want to hear. So there's a matter of both. And on that issue of vulnerability, I'd say this, that any student, and this is part of the first 2 weeks of the intensive work that's done here, students very clearly are led along a path where they are hopefully led to 2 things will happen. One, a safe community sense with respect for individuals is created so people can speak not just what they think people want to hear, but the realities that are around them. And as well, the people who are speaking need to learn to speak the truth in a way that another can hear it. So you create a safe community, and I would say that as well for anyone who is a supervisor. So that's one piece of it. And I work here a lot with them to say that in truth, we are looking for not you to put up walls and just show us the things you're competent in. The whole point of this is if you're going to learn, you have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to say what frightens me to death. You have to be willing to say, I don't know what I'd do if I'd go there. And we will help you, as will your supervisor, if you will tell them that. We will assist you in becoming less frightened, hopefully more comfortable, and our goal would be at least minimally competent, for the simple reason that you're going to run into this over and over again. And the fact is that even in situations where that particular quality or state of mind is not actually present and required, if you go into it not knowing with the fear, and that's not what's even happening, you're not even able to be present to what the person is presenting you with, because you're frightened to, I hope he never says this, oh my God, what will I do if? So, I do a lot of work here in the first 2 weeks talking to them about the necessity of being in a state of mind where they're willing to tell us where their fears are, where they're willing to say, this has been my past history, and because of this, I am particularly vulnerable when. Well, good. Yeah. We'll work with that.
Yeah. Carmel, I might just get you to speak to like the benefit and why we do this type of an internship, or at least offer it, and we require it of some in our programs, because many who are online today are doing supervisions in their parishes.
Yeah.
And they may have students who have done this type of a program, but they might not. They may, and so you were asked to take somebody in a less formal and structured context, someone who is preparing for a ministry, but they haven't been given the opportunity to go to this kind of personal and this, like last week or a couple of weeks ago, we had Bill Bartlett along for a couple of sessions talking about action reflection and those types of things. But just kind of mention it.
So someone, let's say you're in a situation where they haven't had the work. The fact of the matter is this, and I'm going to move it into this is why we've written these particular goals here in a way that students and hopefully supervisors can understand. So the second one is their awareness of how their attitudes, their values, their assumptions, their strengths, and their weaknesses affect their pastoral care. Just having something that's objective like that, and I would suggest to you, even if you don't have a formal program, that you take something as a guideline so that between you and the student, the person gets to understand what it is that's required if they're going to be involved in a particular ministry, so that it is on the table to be discussed, and it's not just you being nosy or you being, difficult, but they understand that there are actually core values, competencies, skills, attitudes, ways of integrating into faith that's required if they long-term are going to be working with individuals. Because if they're not only is there potential for harm to the person they're visiting, interacting with, which would be disastrous if it were done in Christ's name and in the name of the church, but we know it has been done, but it would be disastrous. But on the personal level, for the person who's the minister, it'll destroy their souls. Mm-hmm. So when you're a supervisor, you need to talk to people with things that they don't usually talk about, so that they understand the opportunity, the grace, and the flip side of that is the danger. That not only the person they're visiting, but they themselves are in if they don't do some work on a regular basis with someone. Because we can all get pretty lax and pretty flippant. We think we've done that and we don't pay attention. Well, that's why so that's the pastoral. I'm not going to go into a whole piece here, but then that notion of being able to engage and to receive, and it should be in there as well, receive and apply support, input, insights of peers and of the supervisor as they see and hear people. So we do a lot of that through, if you're doing it in supervisory capacity, you go by saying, I've been with you, I've seen what happened. Did you notice what happened when you said or did? Did you realize that the minute you asked about anointing someone, the tone and tenor of this engagement changed, and that the daughter or son did this, that the person that was there seemed no longer present? Why do you think that might have happened? Did you prepare for this? Did you explain to them what you were doing? What happened? So that will be at that kind. There's skills. I mean, these things, I can send this just as because it's a kind of a pretty general sense of a framework in which you'd look with a person. But to particularly, so Rick mentioned the action reflection, and it's also called a praxis method, where you look at what you do, you look at how you do it, you look at the beliefs behind it, you look at the outcomes you expected, and then you compare those to what actually happened, with the intent being that you constantly improve your practice, that you constantly become a vehicle, a tool for God's presence and God's healing grace. That you don't get in the way of God's action. That's one of the images that I use throughout this program is that of, and it comes from Japanese culture, which is that of learning to become like the hollow bamboo that transports water. That you are not the show. God's grace is the show. Get rid of the blocks and just be that hollow bamboo. And if you can do that, let me tell you, your ego immediately takes a back seat. And that's when you're willing to look at, okay, what's gotten in the way here? Because really, anybody who's presented themselves for ministry, if they've gone through any kind of selection process, and I mean any kind, normally it means that they're there for the right reasons. They want to be an agent of God's presence. So if you constantly bring people back to that, and what is it that blocks it? Sometimes it's lack of skill, lack of experience, a lack of awareness. And those are all things we can build on. None of those have to be an impediment to ministry. So the big thing is to create a space where the person understands this is not an attack on you. We don't want you to pretend you're somebody you're not. Because in the long run, we're concerned about God's action. We're concerned about your health as one who is able to deliver that. And as long as you're pretending and holding back, you're never going to be the minister you want to be, that you're called to be. You'll never be able to be, even see and hear what's in front of you, because if all the time you're just interested in getting on with your business, if all the time your focus is on what you're doing instead of what's happening there with that person, you're really in the wrong space. Find something else to do. Work at paper, do whatever. Whatever, find if the church has said, yes, you're called, well then find another spot to minister. So let's look at some of those. And then Rick asked me, so these are the kinds of things. I can send you this, and these are more so that's the goals, and then these are the specific outcomes. For example, in pastoral presence and skills, that people learn to risk, and that's the word, risk. Offering appropriate and timely critique of others, for example, in small groups, if you bring your people together in small group, so that they see and hear what a person did, and that you don't just sort of sit there saying, well, if I say it about him, when my turn comes, I'm going to be torn apart. Well, no, you're not, actually. That's not what this is all about. This is about being able to, so that you who listen to what the person says about, let's say you weren't there this time, but you hear what they say, that you're willing to ask the questions to say, it seems to me that you said, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And then hopefully they'll tell you something, and then you won't just sort of sit back and not take a chance. Ask questions, find out, risk asking. And if the person says, no, that's not what happened at all. Okay, tell me what did. And why did you do that? What did you see happening around you? How did you feel after? Did they tell you it was very nice, but you need to come back again? Or whatever it might be. So I'll hand you these. But the big question, so that sometimes people say, well, how am I able to be objective when I do this? Let's say I get somebody to supervise that I don't particularly like. That can happen. First thing I'd say to you right off the top, just like I ask for the students to be self-aware, is for the supervisor to be self-aware. So if right away you can see that there's going to be sparks every single time you meet, don't be a supervisor for that person. Find somebody who can. Now, if everybody has the same experience, well then this is totally different. Then actually, I've never seen it happen, but even just speaking about it, then I would think what you would have to do is have at least two people with the person, so that one supervisor keeps the other supervisor, I'll say, honest. Okay? Because there are students who can really, you wonder, what did the bishop see here? What did ACTO see that I'm not seeing? Because I have no clue why anyone ever sent me this kind of person. And if that's the case, well then, that needs to be communicated definitely with whoever it is that's like someone myself who's coordinating the program. The other piece, before I get into some of this just very briefly, is to say that you are not alone when you supervise. You're not just sort of, taken and tossed out on the sea with this student and you have to do what you have to do. If you're having challenges, if you're sensing huge breakthroughs, whatever the case may be, you are part of a team. If you've been asked to supervise, there should be opportunity built right into that process whereby you and the person who is responsible for the whole program has a chance to interact. It may be by paper, it may be by phone, it may be by email. Hopefully it'll be in person at least once or twice so that the conversation can flow. Okay. So the thing is this: if there's a clear enough program and description written of what's involved in a period of supervision for a student, if the student, and because here, for example, I'll ask students to look at each of these areas: pastoral self-awareness, presence and skills, and theological reflections, and students are asked to write particular goals for themselves in relation to it, depending on who they are, what skill level they already bring. And those are not just sort of wishy-washy, like I want to be better at theological reflection. Well, whoop-de-doo. We're really glad for you, but they're specific. And that's where the conversation begins. So you're not starting in a vacuum. You'll have the program. Hopefully you'll have some goals from a program, whatever it is, set out for you. Students should have goals, and then you say, well, how can I say that I'm being objective? Actually, the better written those goals are, and we try to get them to refine them here, but of course until they actually go to the situation that they're in, they can't totally make them applicable to that ministry, that situation, that set of people. Someone going to do their placement in a surgery unit, someone going to a mental health facility, someone going to a long-term care where people have dementia would be very different from someone in a merge, someone going to the Janeway, to a children's hospital. So yes, they can have general ones, but they work with the supervisor in that space to make sure that there are ways that they can work on. So that's the first piece, so that you hopefully will have a goal in clarifying a space to help students clarify their goals. And then the conversation should flow. And if, please God, students understand that there won't be growth if they continue to hide the areas in which they grow, and that's partly in this program, that's a big piece of my work, to make sure that that happens. And I have to say, it happens. They're good at it because they, again, most of these people really, really want to be that hollow bamboo. They really do. They want to be able to bring or to bring awareness to people of how God is present in their lives and what that can mean for them, particularly in times of crisis, in times of struggle, in times of blessing too, so that God doesn't sort of get left on the side. So those would be the main things. So objectivity doesn't become as big an issue unless you have personality problems with that person. If you start at the beginning with helping them clarify their goals, letting them watch you do it, and to let them know, because I do it this way doesn't mean you have to. However, there are certain things you can never do, but get them to find their own style. That's that whole notion of what does it feel like for me to be minister? What does pastoral person? Because what it is for me and what it is for Neil, what it is for Nancy, what it is for Paulette, what it is for David is going to be different. Because that's the beauty that God's made us all different. So we can bring different things, be different things. So objectivity normally should not be a problem if you know the program goals, if you know the individual's goals, and if you know the setting that they're in, so you get a sense of how it'll be exercised. If it does become difficult for you, get in touch with whoever is the person who sent them off to you, and see if all three of you may need to sit down because you really don't know where to go. And that's fine too. There's nobody, like, you don't know until you try to work with it, how it's going to play out. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for a second. Oh, no, except to say I'm not, because so the honesty should, given that the honesty should just, I can't imagine that process being engaged without there being honesty. Mm-hmm. And if you have a resistant student, let the people who sent them to you know, they'll deal with it. Mm-hmm. If in the absolute worst situation that occurs, where a person refuses to enter into the process, I know I'd have no problem pulling them out of the program, saying you are unable to complete this. We're sorry. Maybe some other time you could, but right now you are not ready to do this program.
Yeah. And an important part of it is recognizing that it's all part of discernment.
Yep.
And we all have a role in that. Colleges do, dioceses do, people who take on the supervisory role. And so important to help people when they're asked to take on a role as supervisor, to recognize it as, as we call this, supervision for ministry, and it's a ministry, a distinct ministry within itself, that hopefully there's been discernment about who ought to be a supervisor, and that they recognize that, part of it is helping discern a vocation. Sometimes that can bring with it that the person who thinks they have a call is the last one to recognize the fact that whatever you're called to, it isn't a fit with what we do and what we as a church would say. Carmel will, I know we'll be wrapping up soon because we have a few other things to do, but I just ask you to kind of put the focus on the few other important things that you want to bring in.
Yes, I'm just looking right here.
Yeah.
So the objectivity should come naturally from the process. If it doesn't, the process needs some more work. Simple as that, okay? Yeah. Being honest, there's no value in beating around the bush. People in ministry usually fall into one or two categories. Those that are very blunt and can do damage. And maybe there are times when bluntness is the only tool because someone resists every other one. But the piece to walk in there is there's no good either to sugarcoat what you're saying so much that the person you're supervising sitting there is saying, they're trying to say something, but I'm not getting it. Kindness to the point where they haven't got a sweet clue what you're talking about is not kindness. It is absolute death because the person, again, can't grow. They don't know what you're saying. So, I have students will say to me all the time, you tell me the truth. Yes, I do. But I tell you the truth in a respectful way in the context of your call. I'm not out to destroy anyone. I'm here to build on what God's given you and to give you the benefit of, the years of practice of others and myself. So that there is no value whatsoever in being so sweet about it. They haven't a sweet clue what you've said. And rarely, but there are times if someone does something serious enough and is unwilling to hear, sometimes the blunt tool is the only tool. And if that's what it takes to get someone to get their attention, well, that's what you use. And to know that you're not doing this as me out to get you. This is about me as a person with responsibility for care of others and for discernment and to the church, trying to help you either grow into who it is you're going to be as a minister or to come to the awareness that if you're called to ministry, it may not be this one or it may be not at this time. So there's literally no, you have to be honest. You have to be honest. 99% of the time, it happens automatically. If the right work has been done with students. If it hasn't been done, well, then I would say to you to try to engage that piece yourself from the beginning when you meet them with the looking at their goals, their covenants, whatever, their learning goals, whatever you call them in your particular area. The other piece that I want to look at right there is to look at the periodic evaluations and final evaluations. It's no good for someone to go through 4, 8, 12 weeks, half a year or a year, and to be given absolutely nothing except for ongoing conversation. At regular points, it's important for that person who is being supervised to see something concrete, and I would say written, in terms of the goals that they've presented to them for reflection. So that we say, okay, where are we now in this process? How far along are you? So if we don't do this, we don't know where to go from here. We don't know what the next step is. So it's really important. And I will say it's not good enough just to have a conversation. It needs to be written so that the person can take it away and look at it on their own. Generally, I would say those evaluations should happen in a way that it's not just the supervisor doing the evaluation on those goals. It should be that the person who's being supervised writes something about how they are on those goals. The supervisor writes something about how they are on those goals. That together you sit down and you talk about, are you seeing the same thing or not? Where are the gaps? And then to determine with the person, where do we go from here? So that those evaluations are not just, this is the way it is. They are, okay, this is what we're both seeing. Here's where we're seeing things the same. Where do we go from here? Here's where we're seeing things differently. Where do we go from here? So they need to be, and I would suggest minimally, there needs to be 1, and I would say 2, ideally, if you can, depending on the length of time you have the person, 2 of those before a final evaluation. If you don't have them for a long time, at least 1 written one that you've discussed with them and they understand. And you're working together for the same thing. I mean, really, you're in partnership preparing someone to be God's instrument. And if you see it that way, it becomes very, very life-giving for the person doing the supervision as well as for the person who's receiving that ministry. So that they should at least get 1 written one before their final one. And then, of course, the final evaluation. So those, I think, are the main pieces that I was asked to address. Anyone have any questions or comments?
I think that your suggestion there about written is a very important one. Having supervised a number of people, one did not work that in. One worked in sessions with the person, but they were always verbal.
Yes.
And it was verbal on both sides.
Yes.
How do you see this? Do you feel that you're getting your gifts are being affirmed? Where do you see the gappage that we're not providing that you're looking for, etc., etc.? But they're always verbal. But I can see the importance of the written, but it never entered one's mind. Even though,
I think we came across it for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
One of them is the area I haven't done a lot of talking about, which is the theological reflection. Now, in the model that we use, I normally visit or see the students every week to 10 days. And the purpose and point of my visitation with them, checking in with the supervisor, if the person's available at that time, is to do some of this with the students. So I'm walking a line between a kind of a theological reflection and spiritual mentor, and that's the role I generally play. Now, if that's not available to you, you need to do that with them. You really do need, and if you don't have a particular method, And I don't like generally just teaching methods for the sake of them, but when you're working with students, they have to learn something.
Yeah.
So find out, first of all, if they've been taught any method of theological reflection. We will teach our students a method as we're doing this, so that if no one else is doing it, you have to ask. I mean, the big conversation, the conversations can always be at the what did you say, what did you do, what did you feel? But then somewhere along the line, because we're preparing them for a life of ministry in the church and in response to the gospel, we need to pull back and say, okay, now take a step back from that. What exactly, where do you see God present in this? Where is the gospel being fulfilled? Where is the role that the church says it presents? How are you holding that? How are you sharing that? Where are you finding it difficult, if not impossible, to do that?
Yeah.
And let's reflect on that, because ultimately this is coming out of your sense of call.
Yeah. Actually, Carol, our last class in this whole series is on March 22nd. Before we finish today, we'll hopefully name a few items that we want to give a little attention to in our last class. But so don't be surprised if I'm saying, Carmel, are you going to be around on 22nd?
I can be around
because
on 22nd.
I think that would be actually kind of a good way for us to wrap up this program. Is to kind of do an experience of theological reflection ourselves. So anyway, but likely later today I'll say, Carmel, you want to do that? But anyway,
again, like that's something we do all the time. But what I would say to you, if you are in a situation where it hasn't been structured, I mean, this didn't just sort of fall into place. This has been developed over the years as we've seen what's required, and the blessing that SPM has been is that because we're sort of a free floating body who are training people primarily for pastoral ministry within the church as opposed to institutions, although what we do fits quite well for there, because we're kind of free floaters, we've been able to refine and develop pieces that may not always be developed or refined or brought in the same way as has been in CPE. So that's given us that flexibility. But anyway, that's the sense. So if that piece is not there within the model, the theological reflection, I would strongly encourage you to include that. And again, if next week or whenever it is, the 22nd.
2 weeks from this,
So if that's something, we can look at that.
So
again, just before we finish up here, does anybody have any comment or question?
Just one comment, and that is, I used to supervise 40 or 50 people, and if you get to the point of writing a written piece of feedback or evaluation, and something on that evaluation comes as a surprise to the person you're giving it to, that you've probably failed to communicate well during the interim period, and you should really take a look at how you're doing that.
Interesting point. And of course, in so many workplaces, when things are written, it's part of a more formal grievance or kind of an adversarial type thing. An interesting observation and helpful actually for us to kind of, it really loops back to, teaching old dogs new tricks, because so often that is the mindset and people have that interpretation of it. So it's an interesting observation and important then to be clear on why we do things as we do. But I love your point also that, that walking with people and having the frequent conversations and so on, what's written shouldn't be the first time someone is made aware of something,
They should
It's
not.
like annual performance appraisals with people. If the first time an employee is finding out that there's a problem with their attendance or their whatever, you've failed. It's not a reflection on the employee. It's
equal responsibility in that situation for sure. There was one other thing just crossed my mind. What was it? I don't know. Can't be that important. I thought it was when it ran it.
You'll likely get a chance to bring it to us in a couple of weeks.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if anyone wants this, I'll give it to Rick and he can send you a.
Yeah, well, you just forward it to me and I'll send it on just so people have it to take a look at. I mean, part of what this is about is not to say these are the only ways of doing things, but to give exposure to some of what we do and know that there's a resource for it. But again, helping to understand why some of the components of different types of supervision or different models are there. We're in the fortunate position here of having SPM as kind of a model that we've created to give us the flexibility that we needed, but then we also have available CPE for students who we feel that would be a better fit with, so we're fortunate in that regard. Somebody must have their microphone on because I'm hearing some background noise, but that's fine. Folks, we're going to of course, if you're at home or if you're here, either feel free to go and grab a cuppa or take a break of one sort. But we're going to forge on, and we're going to forge on right now with the thanks, Carmel, for that again, incidentally, and we'll be in touch about the next session.
Yep.
Well, we're going to forge along with the sessions from the chapters from the book by Floating on Engage, and the topics. Neil isn't with us today, but he will do the topic next week on faith formation, or in 2 weeks when we meet again. Church administration. Paulette, this falls right in line with what Neil talked about earlier on today. I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to do so, to take to make it as succinct as possible, because as you can see, the time is running out. And ironically, one of the things I want to touch on today is time management. But anyway, Paulette, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, thank you. My chapter was, of course, like you just said, about church administration, and the author was the W. Joseph Mann, and I didn't take the time to look him up, which I should have, I guess. But he quotes this Christopher Stendhal, who's a great New Testament scholar and dean of Harvard Divinity School. And one of his quotes is, "Administration is a gift of the Spirit. Any work worth doing involves administration, and administration is a gift of the Spirit." And he quotes Romans 12:7 from the Revised English Bible to reinforce that. And this guy that wrote the chapter said, through seminary, said one of the areas that he was least prepared for and would indeed have to learn was administration. And he also says administration skills are hard to teach in the abstract, but when students see the immediate relevance, talking about administration is far from being boring. And he also looks at effectively ordering the life of the local congregation empowers the people of God to engage in ministry. So he's really looking at administration as ministry, and again, as a gift of the Spirit. And he alludes to the fact, which a lot of us know, that it can mean most of us don't enjoy like record keeping and data collection and filling in report forms. But at its heart, it has to do with how the church engages in a variety of tasks: word, sacrament, service, and witness. Administration is holy work, he says. It says there should be 4 priorities, and I'll go through them quickly. One is ordering the life of worship and the sacrament. And lots of times, you know, we probably don't think of that as administration, but it is. Second, observe how the congregational leaders are nurtured and sustained in their work and their roles. Because we, looking at the work of lay recruitment, training, and support, it says is really at the heart of fruitful ministry, and it is administrative work, because volunteers, of course, are the backbone of the church and ministry. Third, note how the programs and mission of this congregation are ordered. So pastors also help a congregation determine how it lives out its Christian engagement in the world. That's one of the jobs, and You need to look at in the administration what this congregation is called by God to be and do, not only in the life of the church, but in the life of the community. Most clergy say that their least favorite work is record keeping, but as we know, that is all required. So again, it has to be part of the administration. And data is important because it can help you determine the effectiveness of certain programs and initiatives, and also helps you understand your internal community and your external community. It says a good administrator certainly has a heart for ministry, but you also need to have a head for ministry. And the fourth thing is, how will you order your own life? And he just mentions here that in seminary he was working in a local church and at a mental health center, and the teacher was Henry Nouwen. Henry was always worried that clergy engaged in a remarkable degree of busyness to avoid the harder inward look of prayer and silence. So in that you have to be careful, I guess, because administration can overtake what we should be about, and that's like beginning with our own spiritual and prayer lives. A good administrator doesn't just put more and more work onto the plate. Instead, clergy must learn the rhythms of prayer and action, all rooted in the grace of Christ. Good administration means not just doing more work, but making sure you have the time to do the work of a spiritual leader. And learning to be a servant leader and helping order the life of a congregation requires a deep spirituality. So important. So it says, try in your field education to see administration through the lens of ministry. You have the authority to help order the life of the church. The Spirit gives you the gift of administration. So he ends like he begins. And that's it.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Paulette. Great summary of a great chapter indeed. Any comments on it?
I think the linkage that was made there about administrative skills and a good, firm spirituality was an excellent point. And so often they're not connected as they should be.
Yeah. And he made the point, Woody Allen along with Henry Nouwen, but about the importance of how we manage our time. We almost said 80% of success is following up being there. That's about attendance and about participation and engagement, all those words that we use on these things today. But it's about being organized, as Neil had said in his presentation earlier on. That was great, Paulette. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And again, this is just a great chapter, a great book, nice, succinct on so many different themes. Ruby, we'll pass it to you on faithful leadership.
Okay. Chapter 15, Engaging for Faithful Leadership by Kyle J.A. Small. The ability to cultivate a spiritual depth is the primary focus of this chapter. The chapter shares two different experiences between the intern Micah and his supervisor as he seeks feedback during his field education. The first encounter was minimal feedback and not helpful. In addressing this, Small breaks the chapter down into 6 sections, beginning with learning to lead as an intern. We all seek feedback on how we are doing, and being human, we hope for positive feedback. However, Small notes that central to becoming a leader is having the ability to cultivate an inner depth to respond to disappointment and failure with compassion and self-differentiation, and the ability to explore these with inner curiosity, compassion, complexity, and contemplation. Next, we look at learning as adult learners. Here he notes that learning is action-centered, and you, the learner, are the agent of the action. Start by asking, what do I want to learn, and how will I assess my own learning? To respond to those questions, the learner needs to be ready to learn and to take responsibility for learning. The questions asked when seeking feedback on how one is doing should not be ambiguous, but rather need to be framed in such a way that the responder answers the learner's true questions. This requires skill, maturity, and patience on the adult learner's part. Roadblocks that may get in the way of asking these questions are the fear of failure, being rejected, criticism, or asking the wrong questions. All things that create anxiety and are paralyzing. I remember in formation that everyone wanted to give the impression that they already knew everything, and this often is carried over into our placements. We cannot experience the fullness of theological field education with these barriers before us. The third section is readiness and responsibility for feedback. Both intern and mentor experience paralyzing feelings which both lead to discomfort, block honesty, create tension, and resistance. All of these are needed for a learning environment. Passivity and being nice is not what feedback is about, so learning to receive honest feedback is important. Small notes that although a learner longs for learning and acceptance, the ability to ask for feedback should focus on who to ask and for what purpose. This requires risk and asking specific questions. Feedback may come through affirmation, coaching, and evaluation. And Small highly recommends learning covenants. Although I feel there is some use for these, I feel it is hard to seek in areas that you don't know what you need to learn. Section 4 is getting to the heart of learning. This is about cultivating a growth identity through feedbacks, which includes our baptismal vows, being rooted in God and not our own accomplishments or failures or judgments. Leadership and growth identity develops through deep spiritual formation that seeks to love the world, contemplation, curiosity, complexity, and compassion. Section 5 brings us to a lifelong learning leader. One method of doing this is through contemplation, but small notes: one must be ready in terms of your inner journey in spiritual and psychological integration to discern God's call and freely embrace it and fulfill it. One must stay present to difficult feedback and seek it from trusted and wise mentors. And the final section is learning from depth and feedback. And here Micah returns for feedback from a supervisor, which with much better results because the questions asked were direct, clear, and focused. They both were authentic and vulnerable in their conversation, which opens lengthy conversation and sound advice being given. Micah is encouraged to keep God in the forefront of his leadership, such as beginning meetings with prayer or scripture, which invites God into the situation. And when feeling anxious about feedback, practice connecting the mind, heart, and body through deep and slow breathing as an act of prayer. Receiving good and sound feedback is a two-way street. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Ruby. And I found this chapter to be really good in that it reminds us of the importance of students with disabilities to be able to go for good information themselves. Really helpful. Getting feedback for some reason. Maybe I'm coming in very loud on your computer, Ruby. Any further questions or comments to Ruby? Okay, Charlene.
Okay, I'm here, sorry.
Okay, you're in the chapter on public ministry, engaging in public ministry.
Yes, that's by David W. Watkins III. Engaging in public ministry means engaging in social justice. It means wanting to make the world a better place to live, work, and play, and being willing to work towards that, being willing to challenge the status quo, to fight injustice. Watkins defines social justice as the visionary pursuit of a just, equitable society in which all people can flourish with dignity, respect, and equality so that our life and community is enhanced. He believes that engaging in social justice is a crucial yet often neglected aspect of the call and vocation of clergy and congregations of Jesus Christ. While the priestly and pastoral functions of clergy and congregation are certainly important roles to which we are called, it is also important that we confront injustice and address complex social issues from a biblical and theological perspective. And Watkins says that to fail to do the latter is biblical, theological treason and ecclesiastical malpractice. He says to reduce the gospel to ministry to the saving of souls and the proper performance of ritual is to minimize the incarnation of God in Christ and to be derelict in the duty concerning the very people Jesus identified himself with: the hungry, the naked, the sick, the stranger, and the imprisoned. Watkins then goes on to lay out the best practices for engaging in public faith leadership using the acronym LEAD, L-E-A-D. L, listen deeply. E, examine critically. A, act justly. D, develop spiritually. Listen deeply, and I'm going to try to even make this even shorter than what I have there for this one. Engaging in social justice begins with listening deeply. First, you've got to acquire firsthand knowledge of the community by immersing yourself in the community, becoming a part of it, as well as, bathing that community in prayer. Be curious. He says target 3 to 5 influential leaders in the community, asking them what the most pressing needs of the community are, and find out what the congregations have to say about those needs, because sometimes there is a disconnect. He doesn't say that, but I do. He says ask good questions. Also get the leader's perspective on the joys and injustice in the community. Get names of other contacts, and as well make sure you hear from the voices of the unheard, the people who don't always get listened to. Be real. Have conversations with the people you meet all along the way. You can find out so much in what they say and how they say it. To do the work of social justice, we must invest ourselves and build relationships in the community where we serve by listening deeply. Be present, be curious, be courageous. This is solidarity for justice. Examine critically. We are encouraged to pray fervently and ask for clarity to learn what issue of injustice concerns you and the congregation. Identify it, describe it, and learn all you can about it. And to examine the historical, the structural, the societal aspects, as well as the legal aspects. And as well as a public faith leader, the injustice must be examined theologically. By examining injustice theologically, you will soon speak as a distinctive, prophetic, justice-oriented voice. Act justly. Now it is time to ask. Now it is time to act, but we must do so carefully. God, through the prophet Micah, in chapter 6, verse 8, calls people of faith to do justice and love mercy. Watkins says that in general, social justice related activities fall on a continuum between charity, otherwise love mercy, and justice, activism. An inclusive focus on charity impedes progress, and an exclusive focus on charity impedes progress towards justice. As you consider power dynamics, charity accepts the existing oppressive power structures, while activism seeks to transform power structures for the common good. So you need to be within that continuum so that while the charity is done, you're working, while you're taking care of people, you're also working on the power structures and making things better all around, so that there's the need for the charity isn't as great because it's been taken care of. Social justice ministry is a team sport. The arduous work of justice must not and cannot be done alone. And develop spiritually, the D. Again, referring to Micah 6 and 8, the call to do justice and love mercy concludes with walk humbly with God. The Hebrew verb to walk humbly literally means to live or behave in a modest manner in God's presence. According to theologian Reverend Brad R. Braxton, adapted by Watkins, social justice working must be connected to sanctified walking. Engaging in social justice with faithfulness, integrity, and longevity requires a deep spirituality. Watkins concludes, I am convinced that social justice as a ministry-focused area is a bona fide high calling from God. I am further convinced that authentic, life-transforming experiences begin with a willingness to take risks and be vulnerable. Stretch beyond your comfort zone. Take the risk. Go. Push beyond the comfort zone and lead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charlene. That was, again, another great chapter. Every synopsis I hear confirms for me the benefit of this book. And I want to come back because I think it has such a clout in that sentence early on in the text on page 98, for those who might have the text. He's talking about engaging in social justice and what have you. And his last sentence, he says, I contend that failing to confront injustice and address complex social issues from a biblical and theological perspective is biblical/theological treason and ecclesiastical malpractice. Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
What a powerful statement. And then he makes a strong case for it indeed. Yeah. And inspiring, really. Any questions, comments, or observations? Charlene, you did a great job, as did Paulette and Ruby, in doing synopsis of these very rich chapters.
Thank you.
Any comment from anyone on any of those?
One comment, Paulette here, one comment I just noticed in the last three chapters, they kind of ended with the importance of the spirituality piece in it, right? Like and sometimes in the busyness we do kind of let that go a bit. I find, myself personally, there are days when I probably need to be meditating or praying or reading more than others, and the days that I need it tend to be the days that I don't do it. So that wouldn't be a very good example, as a supervisor to do that. So it's a good lesson. Reading this book is a wonderful book, and I think it really brings those things to light, the spirituality and the listening, and so hopefully I'll continue to read this book and use it as a reference as time goes on to remind myself, and especially if I happen to be a supervisor, well, I guess I'm always a supervisor of so many people, but yeah, so it's good stuff.
And I love that quote from Henry Nouwen pointing out that I think it was in Ruby's chapter that it would be, that sometimes the busyness is in itself a bit of an escape strategy from going deeper and dealing with the more complex and spiritual matters. Anyway, let's push on.
Actually, that was my chapter, and I think that was the sentence that really woke me up, I think. So yeah, you're right, definitely.
Yeah, right, Paula. Thank you. Jolene, learning across generations.
Okay, so this chapter was basically about how we do ministry, connecting all generations, and learning how to bridge the generational gaps that were coming by within parishes. And he said that the church's intergenerational nature presents some clear challenges for our life together and for our practice of ministry. And that different generations may have different understandings of what membership or commitment means, and which this can lead to disagreements or unfulfilled expectations and resentments within the congregation. So the chapter is basically about how we learn to bridge those gaps and to bring these various groups together. And he gives in this chapter 6 key ways to engage generational differences. So the first one was communication skills. And he says that you need to be able to speak clearly from the heart of who you are, and to be able to intently listen to what others are saying. As leaders, we also have to be able to help others listen to each other. And he says that it's important for us to use I am statements rather than we or they, to use open-ended questions, and that it's important for us to seek to understand the other person before seeking to be understood ourselves. And then he goes on to talk about listening for values. Don't just listen to what is being said, especially in the heat of the moment, but listen to what matters to the people. What do they value? How can you show them that you understand in order for you to find common ground? And that people desire to be valued and heard and know that what matters to them is seen as important and that it's not just brushed off or ignored. And then he says about harvesting wisdom. What does it mean to be a community of faith or to be a leader in a community of faith? We need the people of every generation to be able to have a space where they can articulate the things they know, but they've never been able to say before. And we need to take the time to listen to the people and their feedback and find the wisdom within it and understand it and understand where it comes from before you just get defensive or ignore it. And then that probably often makes matters a lot worse. And he says to keep in mind the complex events that have shaped generations' worldview. And I think we all know that in congregations we have people from all generations, and that these people will likely serve on the same committees or be a part of the same groups in our parishes. And before we begin to bridge the generational gaps, we need to be able to understand where each generation then comes from and what they are shaped by. And I found it interesting when he was giving some examples, just thinking about my own parish. For me, I'm the first female clergy that they've had in this parish, so that's been a little bit of a difference and a little bit of a gap that we're working through. And also the inclusion now of the LGBTQ group as well within our parishes. We need to understand and respect all the views and to bring these generations together in a way that's going to benefit the church. And he says it's important for us to continue learning about the generational differences and that there's danger to begin a relationship with a parishioner or supervisor or mentor, assuming that because a person belongs to a certain generation, he or she will behave or believe in a certain way. And he says that even when we have differences, the Spirit still works. And it's important to understand generational differences, but it shouldn't be what we see when we first encounter someone. And for me, some of my deepest friendships and relationships in life are with people from other generations than mine. And when we work together and converse together, we recognize these differences, but they certainly don't shape our relationship or hinder it in any way because we're able to work through that. He says, finally, then, to remember that your presence in a congregation internship represents hope. Because we're raising up a new generation of leaders, and the people are hopeful of what the Spirit is going to do in the church. But he says in that to also be careful that you're not loved too much, or that there's not too much hope and too much expectations put on your shoulders. And in my own experience, I felt like you just need to really work through that and have the people understand you and your limitations. And most of all, enjoy what you're doing and work with the people and be understanding and patient, and just to trust that the Spirit is working with you and with the congregation that you're in.
Great, thank you, Jolene, and that's a worthwhile chapter to have. Gives great insights on, and I found it intriguing, especially some of the examples on what different generations bring to the congregation, the community, and particularly people see it, of course, when they're giving supervision to someone who is from a different generation, whether they be younger than or older than them, which sometimes happens. Any questions or comments? Keep them short if you would. We need to kind of wrap it up. Okay, Ruby is going to be covering the last chapter for that Kay was scheduled for, and that she'll go to next time. But so Ruby, will pass it to you to do a short synopsis before we wrap up today.
Okay, and this is a good, appropriate chapter for today, the International Women's Day.
Yes, indeed.
It's Engaging as a Gendered Person by Kimberly L. Clayton. This chapter focuses on gender identity, and although we are created equal, male and female, this isn't always how it plays out in life and in ministry. In reality, gender is quite complex with a very wide spectrum. However, culturally and religiously, we prefer to remain comfortable with set and exact norms and expectations of what is male and female. Yet Clayton points out that gender refers to social and cultural differences, not biological ones, encompassing social and biological norms and expectations assigned to men and women. In ministry, male preferences still remains the same, still remains with some denominations only allowing males as pastors. Still, other denominations have had women pastors for years, and some now even allow and accept those who are gender nonconforming and transgender. For the intern, becoming aware of gender may be a new experience and something they never imagined. Here they will explore and find their own gender identity. Field education will offer a chance to try on pastoral authority, noticing that gender norms and expectations can affect this role both consciously and unconsciously, impacting how one perceives oneself as pastor. These norms and expectations can also affect how others see and experience you. Personal reflections and feedback from others can be emotionally, especially if your gender becomes the focus of attention. Clayton notes that a supervisor who can discuss the ways gender impacts ministry will be of great benefit. With males being the norm as pastors, women may be seen as other or alternative in ministry. Also, visual images and language shapes what is normal and acceptable and can transform and engage the world and the church, especially when gender-inclusive language is used for God and human beings. Women have struggled in ministry over the years, and although progress has been made, there remains issues. Clayton offers various statistics from the Presbyterian Church in the United States to emphasize this. She also points out how the dress code for men and women clergy has changed over the years, noting that in the past there were many more detailed requirements for women in all aspects of clergy dress code than for men. She notes that women were not to draw attention to themselves, as nothing should distract from the true focus of worship, something that would not be said to men. However, today the definitions of what to wear and not to wear are ever changing. She also points out that engaging in ministry as gendered person entails intentional thoughtfulness regarding public appearance, and she recommends that this be discussed from the outset with your supervisor. Clayton additionally discussed physical and vocal differences, which are not always affected by gender, although women tend to receive more comments on this than men. Internship provides an environment to learn to find your voice and likewise to find self-awareness and confidence. In field education, you will learn to maintain your preferred physical boundaries and respect those of others as well. Leadership styles are not limited to gender norms and expectations, rather they cross gender stereotypes. Men can be found in nurturing roles just as women can be found making hard decisions and dismantling conflict. Gender expectations are much more variable today, and Clayton quotes Anna Carter Florence when speaking of gender barriers to overcome stereotypes, and in part she says she is waiting for the day when students see themselves and peers as preachers rather than male or female preachers. Then we can get on with the business of being human preachers, created by God with all types of bodies, ranges of voices, all manner of taste in music, dress, shoes, and tattoos. Clayton goes on to say, engaging in gender in ministry is not easy, but can be a dynamic gift of the Spirit, and as gender norms reinterpreted and overturned, we are invited more fully into God's extravagance. There you go.
God's extravagance.
That's
What
right.
a beautiful way to describe it.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Ruby. I know that you raced through it because of time constraints on us, but thank you for the summary. Thank you all for those great summaries of great chapters. And I have to say again that I just love that little book. I'm so glad that we came across it and are following it along. Those who are doing the course for credit, of course, have this and other work to be doing, but I think it's helpful to all. The book is easy to get your hands on through Amazon, and a great resource if you ever need to do a presentation on something for a group. It covers pretty well everything, as you see from the presentations. Folks, I had a couple of other little tidbits I was intending to throw in, and I promise to throw them in next time. They'll be short. One's on time management, will only take us a few moments, and the other is on meeting management. But I do want to ask before we go offline if anyone has any particular things that you think we'd like to spend a bit of time on in our next and finals class. Believe it or not, will be in 2 weeks from today. We will look at, some new challenges for supervision, just sharing your own thoughts and experiences and the insights. And I'll do the 2 short sections I just mentioned. But I ask if there's anything else you'd suggest and wish me to arrange for it, including to follow up with Carmel on what she mentioned about kind of an illustration on doing a theological reflection. So I'd like to hear suggestions from you on how we want to shape out that last class.
It's Bob here. Not so much on the last class, but just a question for those of us who are auditing this course. Are we going to receive some kind of document proving that we did this for our bishop, or?
Oh yes, indeed you will. This is a certificate program, so everyone, those who are doing it for credit or for non-credit, will receive a certificate, with the Queen's College logo and done properly and what have you, verifying your completion of the certificate program. Yeah. What I ask everyone to do is those who haven't attended all the classes to verify that they have watched the classes on the recorded classes.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Bob. I should have mentioned it. Anything else that anyone would mention that we want to make sure to bring into our discussion next time?
Rick, I'm just wondering the name of that book.
The name of it is A Theological Field Education Toolkit. Engage is the title. If you're looking at the webcam, it's up there, Engage. The author is, or the editor really, Matthew Floding, Floding, and it's from Roman and Littlefield. That's the publisher, and it's a 2017 publication.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. It's on the course description, incidentally, as a recommended reading text. Yeah. Anything else that anyone wants to draw to our attention today?
Rick, is it okay if we spend a little bit of time thinking about that last class and email you if anything comes to mind?
Yeah, and not only that, we'll throw it open for some wrap-up discussions in our last session. And one of the things I want to kind of inquire a little bit, and you could send me an email on your thoughts on it and give a comment today. We've found this to be a good experience, at least I have, and this is part of what we're trying to do at Queen's, is reach out, make things, put things out there that will help, as we might say, equip the saints. You are the saints in ministry and different types of ministry. And one of the areas that I think I want to build on in this, like the driver behind this, as I've said before, was that we have courses and programs, but a concern has been that we have that we build capacity in the community to ensure that students from our programs or other places as well are able to be provided with supervision that they need to be ready to offer effective ministry, whether it be ordained or non-ordained. And so that's kind of why we came up with this. But over the course of the year, you've heard me mention, and we put an emphasis on our theological education, the courses we teach, that's part of it. We also put an emphasis on pastoral skills and practice. That's what this course is about, making sure there are people who have those skills and competencies themselves, but that they have with it the confidence and the competency to be able to supervise. The other component that we always try to emphasize is spiritual development. And what we're looking at for next year is introducing a certificate program for spiritual direction to give people who might be interested, yourselves and others, opportunity to further discern and to discover and to build competencies in providing spiritual direction to really anyone. To build that spiritual competency, particularly that it can help those who are in ministry formation, but many parishioners, many people are searching, and many people are trying to find meaning, and all of those issues we hear about today, being spiritual and not religious and all of that. I mean, it's really the wrestling with spiritual development, the spiritual formation. So we're looking at a program of that sort next year, probably in the same structure and style as this. If you have a comment on that right now, I'd like to hear it. But if you don't, I'd like your thoughts and ideas on it, because over these weeks, in addition to the other things I'm doing, I'm trying to frame out our program for next year, and it always takes a bit of preparatory time, certainly. Any immediate response to what I just mentioned to you?
Rick, it's Ruby. I think that it's a wonderful idea because not everybody has a spiritual director, and I find we often do that as colleagues, and we hope we're saying the right thing to a friend who's opening their heart to you and helping to guide them, and helping them to keep God before whatever issues or whatever they're facing. And I know myself, if I had some training in that, I would be delighted.
Good. Thanks, Ruby. Yeah. Any other comments?
Bob here. I think that would be something that I would be interested in taking as well. So I would probably sign up for that.
Good, Bob. Great. Good.
I second that too, as Paulette here. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Good. Good. Well, I really appreciate that bit of feedback. I know others. And please send me a note if you have any thoughts or ideas on it in any way. And we'll likely do it in the same way as this one. Develop it as in a format that allows both for credit and a certificate program. But anyway, that's it for now, folks. We went a little bit over today, but we'll go a little bit under next time. And until then, God bless you. Blessings for Lent, and I'll be missing you. Bye-bye.
Bye. See everyone.
Bye now.
My mouse move around.
Okay.
Just that the mouse is not working.
Yeah.